You structured Gutsy Girls in 19 chapters that mirrored Dorothy's life and literary career. Why did you choose this narrative structure?
Well, I didn't really choose it at first. I wrote it in two parts. I wrote childhood and adulthood, and I wrote it in themes. I wrote a chapter about birds. I wrote a chapter about her crushes. So I wrote these sort of thematic chapters, but they didn't kind of work. And I just thought to myself, well, what about if I try and structure it around the books she wrote and what was happening to me, what was happening to her, what was the context and meaning of this book? And that seemed to work a lot better.
Hello, I'm Gabriella Kelly-Davies. Welcome to Season 3 of Biographers in Conversation. In each episode, biographers chat about the multiplicity of choices they face while crafting life stories. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's first storytellers, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The Gadigal people are the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today. You'll find us wherever you listen to your podcasts and on our website, biographersinconversation.com. Let's start the show. In this episode of Biographers in Conversation, we explore the story of two sisters who charted wildly divergent paths in escaping from a fraught family life. Social worker, psychotherapist, teacher and author Josie McSkimming chats with me about her choices while crafting Gutsy Girls, love, poetry and sisterhood. A hybrid of memoir, biography and family history, the book shares Josie's story of growing up in a complicated family as the younger sister of Dorothy Porter, one of Australia's most charismatic and boundary-pushing poets. Dorothy Porter's escape route involved immersing herself in art and poetry. Rising to fame as a poet and novelist, she's best known for The Monkey's Mask, a cult classic queer crime novel in verse later adapted into film. In contrast, Josie's journey led her through and eventually beyond the confines of evangelical faith. For Dorothy, being a gutsy girl meant defying conventions in literature and life. For Josie, it meant finding her own voice beyond the expectations placed on her. Through these intertwined stories, Josie paints a powerful picture of what it means to be gutsy, to challenge norms, pursue one's passion, and support each other along the way, united by love and creativity. Josie, welcome to Biographers in Conversation.
Thank you.
Please tell us about Gutsy Girls, love, poetry and sisterhood.
Well, where would you like me to start?
Wherever you'd like to start. I love the title, but just tell me about the story and how it came to you.
Well, it's a story of my family, as you have said, and it is the story of three sisters who grew up in the northern beaches of Sydney, which is quite a unique experience, I think. But yeah, it's also the story of my own very extraordinary and creative and, wonderful elder sister who died when she was 54. And I guess in the writing of her story, I wrote my story, which was a rather unexpected outcome. I got the idea for the story, and this is not a very academic answer or even credible answer, but I did get the idea for the story from an encounter with a kookaburra. And it is an extraordinary thing because, when I was doing my PhD, I often would go for walks and swims trying to get my head into gear, to get my ideas together, to write. And anybody who's written a big body of work just knows that feeling of not knowing how to write it, what to write. And I had not been thinking about Dorothy's story, but I'd certainly been thinking about her because my parents were aging and I was very conscious of the challenges of caring for aging parents. And my mother had just broken her shoulder. And I was very distressed about what the future could hold for Mary and I. My sister had died many years before. And on this walk, I was admiring a kookaburra, and I'm a great bird person. And as I was staring at the kookaburra, I swear that kookaburra said to me, "Write my story." And I thought, Dorothy is talking to me. Now, I had been thinking a lot about her, about how she would handle the aging of my parents, what her response would be, how much I missed her, wondering what she would be doing with her life now. So it wasn't as though she wasn't in my mind. And I think perhaps ideas about her had been fermenting for some time. But nonetheless, the kookaburra spoke, and I thought, all right. And that very day, I spoke to a number of key people from Dorothy's life and said, "What do you think?" And they said, "All right," including my own parents.
That's amazing.
So that was the germ of the idea, or that was the seed, and that's where it started.
The title Gutsy Girls is a nod to Dorothy Porter's own lyric Gutsy Girls from her legendary collaboration with the musician Tim Finn. What does the phrase Gutsy Girls mean to you in the context of your book?
The title of the book wasn't my first title. I've had several titles over the years that I wrote it. But this one was sort of in collaboration with the publisher, and it really did speak so profoundly and powerfully to me about the lives of us three girls. I always saw Dorothy as immensely gutsy, the eldest of three, the protector of her mother and her sisters in a very volatile household. But also I saw her as far more gutsy than she saw herself. She was always worried about being cautious and timid, and she wrote about this in her long prose piece called On Passion, which is a lovely little book in the On series by Melbourne University Press. And she always saw herself as fearful and not gutsy enough, but that wasn't my impression of her. And this song, Gutsy Girl, was about being gutsy in the face of failing love affair and the torments of a love affair that was breaking up. And it just seemed to typify her as well as me, as well as Mary, because all three of us, I think, were rather captive and captured and affected very profoundly by some of our childhood experiences, and we all had to find some break from that and our own path and our own more preferred sense of self. So the title just seemed to just speak to the three of us, and also perhaps at a bigger level encourage women to find a voice, to find courage, to find a sense of self that is less dominated or less crafted by their families or by their culture. And so it kind of seemed to encompass a lot to me, so I liked it.
Yes, and I think the title does really capture the essence of all that you've just said. I love the cover. It was very evocative. Why did you choose it?
The cover, when you write a book, you have a designer who gives you lots and lots of possible designs. And that picture of Dodd, as I call her, I don't call her Dot, I call her Dodd, from the 80s, is so her. It's got that kind of wry smile, and it's got something kind of a bit feral and a bit wild about it. And the designer of the book cover just was drawn to that photo, because I gave a whole bunch of photos to the publisher. But what I like about it too is that it was meant to have a sort of a Patti Smith feel, like the cover of Horses, which people of a certain generation will remember. If you're not of that generation, you just need to go and look it up. But Patti Smith is standing in the black and white with the black and white background, and it just reminded me of that, and I thought, that's perfect.
It is perfect, and it really encapsulates the whole atmosphere of the story. So why did you choose to write the book as a blend of memoir, biography and family history?
Well, Gabriella, it didn't start that way. As I said, once the kookaburra had spoken, I spoke to various people, and I thought I'd just write a straight bio of Dodd. Now, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a literary biographer. I didn't set out to write an analysis of her work. There are certainly literary biographers, and I thought I'm not going to even attempt that. I can't claim that talent or skill. So I thought I'll just write her story. So I just started writing and reading. I imagined that I would write the story from a sister's point of view, but I didn't imagine that I would then start writing my own story, and I didn't imagine that I would see the parallels between our lives except as I went along. So what was one thing became something else, and it did just blend that way. I mean, when I first wrote just the story of her life, I wrote about 180,000 words.
Oh, my goodness. And how many words did the publisher want?
Oh, they don't want anything. They want about 80. Oh, no, before I even showed it to anybody, I just knew I had to cut it back. But when I wrote it, I thought I'll just write everything without censoring myself. Anything I thought was important, I just wrote it all. But, of course, there's so many details about family, the minutiae, ancestors, which nobody's the least bit interested in, really. It becomes more like a family memoir, family tree, like a kind of an ancestry.com thing. And that all had to go. So it went through many iterations before finding its current form.
Well, I take a lot of solace from Kate Grenville's admission that her memoir of her mother went through 27 drafts.
Oh, I reckon mine was even more. Well, you start writing one, and then you change it all around, and you move this bit here and you move this bit there. I mean, how many drafts? It ends up being about 40, and you're still changing it until the absolute last minute. And I read it now, and there are still things that I wish I'd included, changed. It's never exactly the way you want it, but certainly the blend or the fusion, as you say, was a little bit of a evolutionary process. It was, maybe not an accident of history, but it wasn't entirely planned.
Just flowed out of you and it just occurred naturally.
Well, I think when I was writing her story and I was starting to show it to people who knew Dodd, people were saying to me, what about include a little bit more of you in it? And, of course, once I included a little bit more of me and I realised what was going on in my life at the same time what was going on in her life, I started to realise the kind of the parallel process. And I started to track that through diaries, her diaries, my diaries, and figure out how we were dealing with similar and different events at the same time. And that was quite sort of epiphanous for me, because I thought, oh my goodness, our lives are quite intertwined in some ways, and they ebbed and flowed. We were close and then distant. And, maybe that's kind of the nature of sisters' relationships. They're really static. They change, they evolve. They're one thing and then there's something else, because your sisters aren't really your friends. They're just with you your whole life, and you're responsible for the state of that relationship and the transformations that, those relationships undergo.
Biographers are usually invisible in the narrative, so how did you feel about introducing yourself and your private story into the narrative?
Yes, my eldest son said to me, it's a bit frank. It's a bit too frank. I guess I thought to myself, I've got nothing to lose. At this time of my life and this age, if I'm not authentic and if I'm not open about my life, then it's not going to be an interesting story. And I thought I've been open in other forums, and I'm not really scared of people knowing about my life. I mean, I'm a therapist. I have people who come and see me and they say, it's so weird because I've read your book and you don't normally know this all about your therapist.
Yeah, that's right.
And I say, well, life is different from how it used to be in the time of Freud. But having said that, I try and compartmentalise my story so I can obviously not displace other people's stories. But I did feel that I'm in my 60s now. Now is the time for honesty. And there's a lot of things that I wanted to be honest about, and particularly about some of the ravages, traumas that I experienced within evangelical Christianity. And I thought, if I don't talk about it now, and if I don't talk about my sister's influence in that, when will I? It's a story that is not just mine, but maybe it's for other people as well. I can speak because others are afraid to speak. So maybe it's my responsibility to speak.
And it frees them up to be able to speak. But I found when I turned 60, I just felt emancipated and free to not care what people thought anymore.
That's exactly right. And it's just such a shame that it takes us so long as women to get to the point where we are far less concerned with what other people think of us, how we look, how we sound, all of that stuff. And I thought, it's now or never. And I've got this story, and I've got my own story. And I've written another book about leaving Christian fundamentalism and how it transforms your identity. It's more of a research book. And when I published that, people said to me, what about your story? This is everybody else's story, because it's the story of 20 other people and how they transformed their identity. And people said to me, what about your story? And I said, I don't want to tell it. I'm not ready to tell it. So perhaps I had to write that other story and then experience crippling grief and all the changes that are wrought in you as you age to think, okay, I'm ready to write my own.
Yeah, it's a maturing, a coming of age, isn't it? It really is.
Some people write memoirs when they're in their 20s and 30s, and it's a lot more life left to live.
Now, you grew up with a very domineering father and complex family dynamics that clearly shaped you and Dorothy and how you responded. How did exploring your family history help you make sense of the different paths that you and Dorothy pursued?
I've been thinking about my complex family history for most of my professional life, to be honest, because as a therapist, you do need to be aware of your possible vulnerabilities and areas in your life that can trigger and vibrate when other people are telling their stories. So it's not new for me to be thinking about what happened to us. But I guess I was really thinking about the meaning of some of our experiences, reading some of my childhood diaries, but also reading Dodd's diaries and letters from when we were in our teens. I found that very illuminating because there were my letters, my sister Mary's letters, Mum's letters, Dad's letters, as well as her daily, sometimes twice daily diary. And that also gave me a sense. It's another dimension when you read somebody's letters and diaries or letters that you've written yourself when I was 15 and 16 about how this might have affected me. Because I think probably through my 20s and 30s, I rather minimised some of the horrors that we did go through as kids. I think I might have minimised or sidestepped or compartmentalised that. But as I read through Dodd's diaries and reflected more and more on it, I realised that the three of us did have the legacy of this. We did have the traumatic footprint, if you like. Now, I don't think you can explain all choices because of our childhood. I think that's very kind of deterministic. And certainly my choices and my sister's choices were not just framed by the fact that we had a very domineering father. That's kind of very simplistic. I think Dorothy would have written creatively no matter what. She was writing from the earliest time. She was a total creative spirit and lived in her imagination from the moment she entered this world. So I think she always would have written. But having said that, having grown up in a family that we grew up in, certainly her writing was a refuge. certainly it was a place where she could find some respite and some expansion away from some of the difficulties during her teenage years and also when she was an older woman. I mean, our mother was always a very safe haven for us three girls. Our mother was always a very safe and sturdy, extraordinarily intelligent and wonderful woman, really. And I think without her, life would have been much worse.
She was a buffer.
Well, and, you know, for years I was very annoyed and irritated with her because I thought she should have done more to protect us. But, of course, as an older woman, I realised that she too was at times a victim of this, and her response was protective of us and placating of my father, you know, very appeasing, which did annoy me a lot when I was a younger person. But I understand now that that was to protect us.
You open Gutsy Girls with a chapter titled My Pocket Book of Prayer, with pocket spelled P-O-K-E-T. I'd love you to read it.
And that's how my sister spelled it. Okay, I wrote, my sister's poetry changed my life. In her memoir, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, Jeanette Winterson declares that poetry is not a plaything of the middle class, nor irrelevant to our daily lives. It isn't a hiding place. It is a finding place. As Dodd developed her craft and power over the years, she created finding places for many others, especially me. This book is about how her life and my life wound around each other and how her life slowly altered the trajectory of mine. In Sisters, the writer Drusilla Majeska remarks that female siblings may define each other against the definition made of herself in a complex dance of inclusion and exclusion. Our triad often meant one of us was excluded, and who more likely than me, the grisling baby sister. Our dance shifted between us as we aged through our changing closeness to our parents, our varying proximity to each other, our predictable competitive rivalries and vexations of shared blood, and the competition of who was taking up too much or too little space. Stories within families often have disputed ownership, so to be clear, what follows is entirely my version of my life with my sister. Many people who knew Dodd have their own ideas about what needs to be included or left out. Helen Garner suggests that the sister who records will never be forgiven. Endured, yes, tolerated, put up with, born and still loved, but not forgiven. With that possibility and warning ringing in my ears, I wrote this book. This is my story of losing and then finding both of my sisters. It is also my story of how I lost and then found the hiss and spray of my own voice. And then here's a passage from one of my sister's poems. Do you hear the fighting hiss of this geezer in me? I stand my ground in the undaunted spray and company of my own words from the 9th Hour, which is in her collection, The Bee Hut.
Thank you so much. Why did you enter the story this way?
Oh, look, I had about 20 possible beginnings. You know, I started with a story from our youth. I started with the story of the Kookaburra, all of these. But in the end, I probably settled on a disclaimer more than anything else, because that's kind of what it is. And there have been people who have disputed my version of events, of course. And so I thought, right, I'll get it right out there. This is me. Sisters who write about sisters. It's going to be controversial. People are going to disagree with me. My sister Mary doesn't agree with everything, but we're very close. We've become closer through this process. So, in a way, I thought I'd better just set the record straight before I got started. But it is also about losing and finding sisters. It is about the changing nature of sisterly relationships. And it's also about me finding my voice of feeling strangled and suffocated for many years as a woman within a very high demand religion and casting that off. So it's all there in those first couple of paragraphs.
I think it's very effective, and it just shows us how there's not one monolithic version of the truth. There's no one definitive truth. Everyone has their own truth, and it's just getting that on the table.
You know, as the saying goes, for every event, there are many possible stories.
That's right.
And as I said, people have come forward even since this has been published and said, oh, that didn't happen that way. And I've said, well, that's the way I remember it. That's the way it was discussed with my mother. That's what Mary and I remember. That's what Dorothy told us. I'm not writing an encyclopedia.
You had unprecedented access to Dorothy Porter's voluminous collection of personal diaries and letters. How much of the archive did you study?
Well, I didn't study it all, to be frank. She's got her papers kept in 2 libraries. All of the early stuff, which is the stuff that I found most interesting up to the 90s, is in the Australian Defence Force Academy Library, ADFA, in Canberra. And that was because there was a period of time where ADFA was collecting the papers of Australian writers and paying them quite reasonable money to donate their papers to the library. And Dod was always broke, so she did that. But then there's another whole cache of letters, particularly between her and her partner, Andrea Goldsmith, which is in the National Library of Australia in Canberra, and more letters. And I have not accessed all of that. I kind of thought it's going to be about our family, and I'm not writing a full and complete history of her relationship with Andrea Goldsmith, nor all of the letters that she's received as an adult, because I can imagine there'll be hundreds of letters. Somebody else can have a go at those.
That's a good approach.
I already had all these hundreds of thousands of words, and not everybody is interested in every single detail. And I thought I have to kind of write about what I know, which is the sister story.
Yeah, it's a slice of life. So it's rather than cradle to grave. You've chosen
Yes.
a certain angle. So your father, Chester Porter, published a memoir you believe sugar-coated the family's domestic life. How did his memoir influence or challenge the story you wanted to tell in Gutsy Girls?
I don't think I realised until I started writing the book how much I did want to challenge that. I didn't like that book at all when it came out. 2003, it's a long time ago now. I didn't like it. It's not that I didn't like him speaking about his enormous success as a barrister, because he was quite entitled to speak about that, and it was warranted. He was very successful and was greatly respected in the field, had a lot of integrity as a lawyer, as an advocate. So he's quite entitled to tell his own story. But he didn't write much about us at all in his story, except that, you know, it was a kind of a happy family and never a cross word, sort of I'm paraphrasing. So that annoyed me. It also annoyed me that he wrote, I thought, ignorantly about matters of child sexual assault. And people may say, well, it's 2003, we know a lot more now. In 2003, we also knew a lot. Well, I knew a lot about child sexual assault as a social worker of many years. And he wrote in this book about not believing children and children making up stories. Now, I know that he was coming at it from a very different angle than I did, but I felt very annoyed by it, infuriated, and there was some negative commentary about social workers. And, you know, I took it personally, as I was wont to do. So I guess when I was writing my own story, I thought, now, another reason why Gabriella I needed to be honest. There's no point writing some vanilla tale that isn't the truth, that nobody wants to read.
You spent over a year interviewing Dorothy's childhood friends, former lovers, colleagues and associates. How did you reconcile conflicting accounts that we talked about before?
Well, not everybody wanted to speak to me, so I certainly didn't speak to everybody. I only spoke to the people who wanted to. And those people who didn't want to speak to me were given pseudonyms, somewhat disguised in the story. And look, I don't know. I don't know how I reconcile conflicting accounts. A lot of these stories were fairly isomorphic, if you know what I mean. They actually all did point in the right direction. So I didn't have hugely conflicting things that I had to reconcile. And particularly the stories of Dorothy's lovers and her love affairs while she was in permanent relationship or a monogamous relationship with somebody else. I knew them anyway. I knew those stories because I was there. So I tried to write my version of the event in conjunction with her diary. So some of the people who chose not to speak to me, I am sure they would say to me, and probably have said so publicly and privately, I'm not aware of every word that's said, that is not at all how it happened. Josie has remembered that wrongly. But at the end of the day, it's what was said to me and what I remember. So that was kind of my yardstick. I tried to, I would kind of almost close my eyes and try and transport myself back to the conversations that I had with my sister to try and remember them as accurately as possible in conjunction with my diary and her diary. So in the end, I was relying on my own memory.
To what extent did you immerse yourself in the physical spaces important to Dorothy, and how did being in these places affect your understanding of her life and her character and personality?
Well, the physical spaces are so many. And perhaps when my parents moved into residential care and we had to pack up their house, and I was gathering up all the bits and pieces and the detritus really of their life and all the letters and unpublished poems that were all in my mother's possession. So that was certainly a physical space, and I hadn't expected that she had so much stuff. She also had a whole lot of scrapbooks with every event or every newspaper article that mentioned Dorothy was stuck into these books. I'm looking at them now. There's shelves of them. That was definitely a physical space I inhabited. That house that we all grew up in was very much saturated, redolent with memories. And I didn't have to go too far because they never moved, my parents. Now, as for her, the places she lived in Melbourne, I didn't so much inhabit those. Certainly, I've spent a lot of time with Andrea in her house in Melbourne. That was the last place that Dodd lived in. She lived in Elwood. I certainly didn't go back to that flat because that was a little more brief, that process. But I know that really she really enjoyed the atmosphere and the sights of Coogee. So I inhabit those even now daily where I live. The ocean, the baths, the cafe. I think there's a cafe that we met at that I've quoted in the book, Bazura, down in Coogee, which was a meeting place, not only for Dorothy and I whenever she came to Coogee, we'd always drink our mojitos there, but almost all my interviews and my meetings with my agent all happened in that cafe. So thanks to Bazura Cafe.
Yes, I loved Bazura when I lived there. I also loved the cafe at the baths. To what extent did reading Dorothy's literary works with the biographer's eye reveal new clues about her inner life?
Dorothy's diaries are very interesting because she understood them as some kind of emotional purge. She even said they were like an emotional sewer, that she would kind of drain off all of this excess so that she could write without all of this clouding or muddying her work. So I don't think her diaries are some philosophical masterpiece. I think it would be a terrible thing to have them published holus bolus, because they tend to be more her writing in a fairly agonised way about love, who loves her, who doesn't love her, who she wants to love, who she doesn't want to love. That's her diaries. They're full of passion and love and sexual desire. They're not reflections on the meaning of life, which I guess some people's diaries are. But when I read those diaries, they are her. They are her, but they are not her, because I know that her writing persona was very distinct from her diary persona. She was vulnerable and raw and opening up herself, heartfelt in her diaries. So I knew they were separate. But I did learn a lot about her. But it wasn't as though I never knew this about her. There were certain events that I didn't know, but I knew she was a passionate person who did a lot of agonising, and that's what her diaries are.
To what extent do you think she was writing for an audience in her diaries, or was it just her trying to understand herself?
I've really tried to think about that, because she did write these diaries for her whole life, from when she was 14 and she died at 54. And so there's exercise book after exercise book. She must have known that somebody was going to read these diaries. And she always wanted to be well-known and famous and successful. So she must have thought somebody will read these diaries and will make sense of my life. But she wrote them for herself. There's a big portion which she burnt with one of her partners, because it was decided that these diaries were rather radioactive about one of her lovers. That this was written about in the book. This is her partner, Lynn Hughes, the writer, was very, very upset about these diaries. So there is a portion of them that she did burn, did destroy. You know, I have to just speculate and wonder, because she died suddenly. She didn't have a chance to get her affairs in order. Would she have gone through these diaries and thought, that I'm not going to keep and that I am going to keep? This is a record of my life for a future biographer? I don't know. You know, nothing's been destroyed except what she destroyed herself. So it's very much intact.
Did she leave notes for a future biographer, or was she...
No. She left no notes, and I think she would be shocked that I am the one who has read them. Rather than somebody perhaps a little bit more famous and well-known. Yeah.
You structured Gutsy Girls in 19 chapters that mirrored Dorothy's life and literary career. Why did you choose this narrative structure?
Well, I didn't really choose it at first. I wrote it in two parts. I wrote childhood and adulthood, and I wrote it in themes. I wrote a chapter about birds. I wrote a chapter about her crushes and detailed every single crush she'd had in her life from when she was 4. So I wrote these sort of thematic chapters, but they didn't kind of work. And then in her adult life, it wasn't really thematic. I was just moving in a sort of a fairly chronological way through her life. So it didn't sort of hang together, the childhood and the adult. And I just thought to myself, well, what about if I try and structure it around the books she wrote and what was happening when she wrote those books, what was happening to me, what was happening to her, what was the context and meaning of this book. And that seemed to work a lot better. And again, one of those rather serendipitous kind of ideas that you have when you're out walking, when you can't think of what the hell you're going to do with a book, that idea sort of came to me.
Yeah, that's one of the wonderful things about walking and swimming. Your brain switches off, and if you've been sitting for hours at your computer trying to work something out and just keep hitting brick walls, and then you go for a walk and it all just floods. It's amazing, isn't it?
It can do, and I do appreciate that when it happens. I'm a great believer in thinking and walking and talking and just reading a whole lot of other stuff, and things sort of gel. It's a creative process and you can't force it.
And it's all going on in the back of your head and I guess in your subconscious. Yes. And it's like a melting pot, isn't it, of all those things you read and hear. And I guess that's part of the craft of being a writer.
Look, it is a craft. And I also had a very helpful editor at UQP who I had a couple of chapters when it was going to be published that weren't following. And the editor said to me, no, let's just try and do every book that she's ever written, her unpublished work as well. And that's when it occurred to me that the first book that she ever wrote was that My Pocket Book of Prayer, P-O-K-E-T. So that's the first chapter, because that's the first book she ever wrote.
Yes, that's right. And your mum loved it, didn't she?
Oh, I know. I've got it right here. I've got that book.
Yeah, your mum was so proud of her. Now,
She
chapter
was.
14 is titled Wild Surmised, which is named after Dorothy's first novel, which was shortlisted for the 2003 Miles Franklin Award. I'd love you to read the opening passages.
Okay, I'm happy to do so. Dod was bathing in glory after all the success of The Monkey's Mask at Crete, but she was also learning the price of fame. Not everybody wants to revel with you in it endlessly. It is almost impossible to succeed as a writer in this country, and Dod was that rare thing, a famous poet, a unicorn in the literary landscape. What was it like for Dod being famous? She loved it. Writing it was full of whoopee. We were now having long weekly phone calls. I craved acknowledgement from her, knowing she understood the family dramas, while she felt buoyed by my never flagging adulation and emotional support when she struggled with loneliness and the vagaries of intimacy. I had always praised her successes and admired her, as we had never been in any form of serious, competitive sibling relationship, but I understood others' fatigue. Andy was struggling with comparisons to her own work, while many of Dod's friends stopped asking her questions about her triumphs, preferring to have gossipy chats about fellow literary identities. In truth, Dod could be tiring company when she was bathing in jubilation about her most recent trophy. One of Dod's most memorable and engaging public appearances was on Margaret Throsby's music show on ABC Classic FM. This seriously indicated to me that she had arrived. My sister was now a member of a very small club of famous Australian writers. She relished every minute of this lively exchange with Margaret, telling her she was throwing down the gauntlet to prose, as poetry tells better stories and cuts to the chase with a hotter temperature. Dod said about the dangers of sexual infatuation. It is like being in champagne and then dragged to the bottom of your own soul, a quagmire you don't want to drag yourself out of. Margaret responded, I'm grateful for now being so much older and wiser. Measles is worse when you're grown up, Dod retorted, quick as a whip. Margaret laughed like a drain, as we all did listening at home. Dod shared her favourite music, the overture from Rossini's Semirimide. Maria Callas sing L'amour est un oiseau rebelle from Carmen, and the aria, E lucevano or lucevan le stelle, and the stars were shining from Tosca. The love duet of Akhenaten, and Nefertiti from Philip Glass's Akhenaten, and finally the second movement of Beethoven's astonishing Seventh Symphony. She had an eclectic taste in music, and it fired all her work.
Oh, I just love that so much. Thank you. I wish that we had time for you to read the whole chapter.
Oh, that's very nice of you.
So what's the significance of this? What does it tell us about your sister?
Well, Wild Surmise is actually my favourite book that she ever wrote. And for somebody who was often fairly chaotic in her private life, it's a remarkably well-observed and profound book about intimacy and marital infidelity and death and grief. It has it all. It's a terrific book, and it's still available. It's still able to be read, and it meant a lot to me because I was going through so much drama of my own when she wrote this book. I was leaving the church. I felt my marriage was in trouble. I was starting to think about affairs. I was in a very tumultuous place. So I feel like that book was a turning point for me because it was so well observed and it seemed to be speaking directly to me. But it's also about a shift in our relationship when she really did start to speak to me far more intimately than we had for some years. She knew I was leaving the church. She trusted some of my thinking and reflections as a psychotherapist. And we became very, very close. So the book, it's about her success. It's about my change. I was pivoting. It was a real turning point happening for me in my life. And it's about our closeness. So the book is sort of at a significant juncture in my life and in her life and in our relationship. Perhaps that's why it's my favourite book, but I actually think it's probably the best written as well.
Yes, I loved it.
Yes, and I think a lot of people like The Monkey's Mask. It's a detective story. It's funny. It's outrageous. It's erotic. But if you want to actually, as Dorothy said, quite strongly, and I think she believed this and she showed it in her work, that poetry tells better stories and cuts to the chase with a hotter temperature, that's what she did in Walt's Fire. She told a story in verse that was really hot.
How do you balance your voice as the narrator with Dorothy's distinctive, very strong voice?
It's very hard for me to answer that because I just tried to write my own voice with as much honesty and frankness and authenticity as I could. So as I said to you, I would sort of sit and close my eyes and try and remember and think. And then I would write what I was thinking and what I was going through. And I guess I tried to allow Dorothy's voice to be there through the words of her diary and also things that she'd written to me. So I've still got quite a hefty cache of emails from her. So I was able to use her exact words. And I think in fairness to her, absolutely, in respect to her, let her speak. And so by using the emails, the diary, my memories, what she said, what I said, letters, I mean, a lot of it's pretty fresh in my mind, even though it was 20 years ago. But I don't see myself as sort of an authoritative voice in the book. I can only really speak about myself with any degree of authority. That's why I thought I have to be as vulnerable as possible. I'm writing about other people. I mean, there's a lot of ethical considerations when you're writing about people who are still alive. Anybody reading the book knows that there are people with public profiles in this book. There's members of my own family. I had to wait until my parents had died. I just could not see my way clear to publish it while they were alive. I thought I couldn't explain it. It would hurt them. My mother knew particularly the content without reading it because I told her. And she wondered if she should read it. And I said it was up to her, but it wasn't going to be a tale that brushed over all the difficulties of our family life. And she said she knew that and she knew it would be an honest account. Anyway, as it turned out, my parents did die and I was much more comfortable being able to publish ethically without hurting them.
And that's so important.
Well, and then there's my sister Mary, and as I said, we had to have many conversations. Through the many iterations of the book, there were many conversations and things that she asked me to take out, things she asked me to put in, and I mostly tried to accede to what she wanted. There's Dorothy's partner, Andrea. I tried to include and leave out what she would want. People will read it, will see that there's a whole cast of characters there. So I really tried to represent people very accurately and fairly, and any conclusions or interpretations I have are mine. And so that's why people can say, and have, that isn't the way it happened.
And that's why you wrote that first section of the book, to say, this is my memory. It might not be yours.
Exactly right.
Gutsy Girls has been called a rare kind of biography with sibling relationships at its core. What do you hope this unique perspective contributes to the field of Australian literary biography?
Yes, I have been told that there are virtually no sisters' biographies around, or memoirs. Maybe you can think of one. I can't think.
I can't think of one, no.
I think that's why people have found it interesting and they like it, because there's lots of memoirs of partners and writing about husbands and wives who've died, people writing about children that they've lost, children writing about parents they've lost. But perhaps we don't appreciate the strength and the meaning and the power of sibling relationships nearly enough. And that's another reason I wanted to write this, to say that your sisters and your brothers, they're not meaningless relationships, even though they're tense and fraught and difficult, and full of fights and jostling for space, oxygen. They're very important relationships. So, yes, I hope that, because most of us are sisters or brothers, I'm hoping that perhaps others might think about writing their own stories, but also just appreciate or acknowledge the centrality of sibling relationships in their life. They're so unique. As I say, they're not necessarily your friends, but you have to work it out with them. And a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to talk to my sisters, or I'm not going to work it out with them. But let me tell you, when you have aging parents and then parents who die, you have to work it out with them.
That's right, because you're the generation.
Yeah.
I think Helen Garner's one of those writers who, she has her sisters who she includes in her books, and so she's had varying responses from them about how she's portrayed them.
Absolutely. And I think that others, as I quoted from that book, which is edited by Drusilla, the one called Sisters, and that's got a series of essays in it that was published many years ago about sibling relationships. That was about the only thing I could find in Australia about siblings. And these little short chapters, and Helen Garner's written one, and Drusilla's written one, and various others. And, I found that a lovely little book, but it's not enough.
No, you can't base a book on it. You've got to do your own research.
Other people, please follow
in your footsteps.
Follow me.
You close Gutsy Girls with a chapter titled Dorothy Porter's Biography. I'd love you to read it.
Dorothy Featherston Porter was a towering figure in Australian literary history, an outstanding and popular poet and verse novelist, and in the latter part of her life, an acclaimed librettist. Porter wrote her first poetry collection, Little Hoodlum, at the age of 21, cementing her as one of Australia's most exciting young writers. She published another 6 books before achieving critical and financial success with her genre-busting verse crime novel, The Monkey's Mask, which won the Age Poetry Book of the Year and the National Book Council's Turndorf Books Phillips Poetry Prize, known as the Banjo. In England, it was named one of the Books of the Year in the Times. Porter's vitality and wit pulsed through every line she wrote. She said poetry should never be obscure, peripheral, or an ordeal, but affect you viscerally. Her many readers and fans came to know her as passionate, iconoclastic, lucid, and the wild breaker of taboos. Her book events filled auditoriums, her engaging performing style and outrageous bawdy humour winning over audiences. The literary critic Jason Steger remarked, "When people talk about Dorothy Porter, it is her energy, her quicksilver spirit, both in her poetry and her life, that they remark on." She continued writing until days before she died, with 3 poetry collections and a long essay published posthumously. Porter was an inexhaustible, exuberant and revolutionary writer. Her immense and innovative body of work survives her and is still changing lives, shocking and shaking us from our stupor.
Oh, thank you. I love that so much. I wish I could have met Dorothy. Why did you choose this way of ending Gutsy Girls?
Well, it was suggested to me by the editor, to be honest. And she felt that people needed to get some kind of bio, but I didn't want it to be too anodyne. I didn't want it to be just a straight bio. So it's written by me. So it's that kind of a bio, but not written like my memoir. It was going to be at the beginning. It was then at the end. Look, it probably didn't matter if it was at the beginning or the end. But it was just some sort of statement for those people who'd never heard of her, didn't know anything about her, about who she actually was, that she was quite the person and remarkably successful. And in Australian literature, people get forgotten. You know, the water closes over the top of people. And so this is a way of saying, yes, she was here, she was remarkable, and this is a sort of a more formal way of stating it.
I thought it was the perfect ending. It really brought all that you were saying in the book together. So, Josie, thank you so much for sharing your creative journey as you masterfully blended biography, memoir, and family history. By intertwining Dorothy's story with your memoir, you've crafted a truly unique book. You achieved a delicate balance between honouring Dorothy's legacy as an acclaimed poet while candidly depicting the complex dynamics of your family life. You brought to our conversation an emotional honesty and literary depth that's inspiring. In closing, Gutsy Girls is a portrait of two vastly different women, both grappling with their background as they forge their own paths. It's an intimate, literary and emotionally resonant journey that celebrates gutsy women blazing their own trails. At the heart of Gutsy Girls is the contrast between two sisters. Dorothy's world was the blaze of creative freedom. She escaped into the arts and love outside convention. Dorothy took Australian poetry to new heights. Josie, by contrast, sought refuge in faith. She spent 35 years devoted to evangelical Christianity, a path of self-denial far removed from her sister's bohemian world, before finally breaking free. Despite their divergent journeys, the sisters remain bound by a complex sisterly bond, by turns fraught and tender, marked by rivalry and mutual respect. Ultimately, Gutsy Girls is a celebration of difference, courage, and creative freedom. Jodie embraces the emotional complexity of sisterhood, the rivalries and resentments, the fierce loyalty and love, to illuminate how two women shaped by the same forces found the bravery to break free in their own ways. So thank you so much, Josie.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you for listening to Biographers in Conversation. Special thanks to my producer, Andy Marr, web manager, Dylan Hamilton Foster, and Sunny Lauderdale for the music. We'd love you to take a moment to rate the show on the website, across social media, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your family and friends and on social media. To discover more about my guests and their biographies, head over to their show pages on biographersinconversation.com. There you'll find all our episodes and ways of getting in touch with us. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about the choices every biographer faces. I hope you are too.